Hey guys, Mark Ferrasci, ProTech Dog Training. Started to do this morning and do my little scenery bit over there, but I realized that couldn't do it because my battery went out. So I yacked at the screen. I was 30-40 minutes into this little life story series that I started yesterday and realized the battery died. So okay, I'll pick it up somewhere else. So I figured, what the hell, we'll do it in my car. You'll miss the scenery today, but that's alright, I'll bring it back tomorrow. So we were talking about Princess, the first dog that I got when I was 12. And I mentioned that I'd moved back with my dad and I had her in St. Louis and was having her on the back of my moped and driving all over town. And getting a little older, I was 12, 13, 14. I went into 16 years of age and I got Sergeant, my shepherd. And in the interim of that, the reason that I got Sergeant was because being a street urchin and being on the streets, basically going through the foster care system of no fault of my own. I was put in a foster care home at 2.5 years of age because alcohol was in the family, and my dad was an alcoholic and my mom died of it when I was 11. So I remember a lady that looked like she was in her 60s, she was in her 40s, late 30s, and I hardly knew her because I had been put into the foster care system. And she died of liver cirrhosis when I was about 11. Then life goes on. So I wanted you guys to know that because I wanted you to realize this, not just because kids are troublemakers that they end up in the foster care system. A lot of times it's broken families. In today's day and age, it's even worse than it was back then in a lot of ways, because now you got this methamphetamine and all these drugs that take away their morals, and it really is all messed up. So the foster care system is the best thing that we have. Before that, if you didn't know anything about the history of this, is they didn't know where to put the kids, so they ended up throwing them into institutions and let them be the labor in the mental institutions. And it was great for getting the jobs done, washing dishes and cleaning the sheets and cleaning the things around them and all that, but then the kids were affected by this environment of being around crazy people. You know, being around the mentally instituted people in the mental institution wasn't really conducive to that child not being affected by that, right? So they ended up coming up with this program and putting them into homes, and they call it the foster care, and the government subsidizes it. And those that are willing to give a child a home and try to give them a little bit better chance in life, they are given a check from the government. And it's not all that much, but it's enough that it helps the family. So it helps the family, and Johnny's got somebody to play with, and here comes the foster kid. So I was a pretty strong-willed child, and basically if I didn't feel love, I would test you, and if I didn't feel the love, I would basically take off. And I would run away. And I'd wait for my probation officer to find me, or I always usually had a business card with their name on it. And at some point I would stop being a little hellion, and I would call my PO and say, okay, I'm ready to come back in. And I remember my PO one time telling me, yeah, I knew you'd call me. You either end up, I end up finding you, you end up either dead or you'd be in jail. And he was pretty much right. So I was always on the outside edge of dealing with life and going from foster home to foster home, and there's a lot of negativity that happens in that, a lot of stories to tell, but I'm not here to tell the story of that. I'm here to tell the story of how I got into my saving grace, which is the dogs. That was what saved me from becoming a hellion and being in trouble myself, because I have something that I could wrap onto that became my identity. I was Mark Ferrasci, the dog trainer, and I've been that as long as I can remember. So as a child, I had Princess, and then as I got a little older, I had that moped that I was riding all over with Princess, and I was getting a little older, and about 15 or 16, I started to get into normal things that kids in my situation would. I was drinking, smoking a lot of dope, and cocaine was my other drug of choice at that point in time. Nowadays, I don't do any of it. Don't drink, don't do drugs, haven't done anything for a long time. So that being the case, it's you mature through it. It's one of the stories behind coming to LA. When I came to LA was to get away from the drugs, believe it or not. And there's more stories to tell. So I've got a full list of stories. But right now we're going to move from Princess riding around on that moped and having Princess in the back of the car until how I got Sergeant, my first shepherd. My first shepherd came to me because I was growing marijuana in my backyard, and I had taught Princess a basic loose guard, where I would take my bike out to the front of the liquor store and I'd put her on a downstay in front of the bike and I'd kind of pretend like I was going to get the bike, and I taught her to bark at me and a loose rudimentary protection type of thing of guarding my bike. And this is way before there was ever ring sport or anything to give some kind of indication of what a dog could do. And a lot of the things that I did back then were before anybody was influenced by a sport like ring sport or a sport like schützen or any of that. I was doing things with my dogs that were very functional in my world, right? Putting my dog down and having him guard my bike was functional because I didn't want to get my bike stolen, right? So I would do things that were relative to what I needed within my environment, and I've done that for all my life. I've come up with all kinds of things, and nowadays this stuff is caught up, or the stuff that you see that is being done, I was doing before it was done for a functional reason. And we'll go over that as I keep telling these stories. We keep going through these series of what I would do with my dog. So Princess had a loose, rudimentary protection dog aspect, and I was already kind of going cool, you know. I wasn't really hooked on it and didn't really know I wanted it until one day I left her in the backyard and took off to go do things that kids do. Who knows what I was into. It was probably up in the canyon areas, riding my moped up there without Princess, who knows. Came back home that day and my pot plants were gone. Boy, was I pissed. I was madder than summer. Who stole my pot plants, you know? And it boils down to, we had a big old farm field behind the house with just a regular chain barbed wire fence, that kind of thing, separating our backyard from the field behind us. And a kid had climbed over and stole the pot plants, ripped them out of the ground. They were all the way up to the eaves. They were a beautiful set of plants. I was mad. So at that point in time, at about 15, 16 years of age, I think I was about 16 going on 15 going on 16, I wanted the German Shepherd. I wanted to have a dog that bite somebody's ass if they came in my backyard. So I started shopping around, and I was working a job at a gas station, pumping gas. Back then, that was a full-service gas stations. And I've always worked. As a kid, I've always worked in a government program because of my situation with the foster homes. I was eligible to be doing plumber's helper. Did a plumber's helper, janitor helper. I did everything. Every summer, I was always working, making money. Or I was working in a restaurant or working in a gas station doing something to service the tourism that we had in our town. So I've been working from a young age. So I would always save my money up and I would go buy what I wanted. The moped was case in point. I bought that moped. It cost me $500 back in 1978, 79, somewhere in there. Sounds like a pretty cheap item, right? $500 was a lot of money for me. But I'd save it up. I'd always put an envelope on the refrigerator and I'd draw a picture. I'd clip a picture out of a magazine or a picture of whatever I wanted, and I'd paste it to that envelope and I'd start working towards what I wanted. That's how I've done that for years. If I want something, I'll set a goal and I'll start saving my money up and I'll get it. So I ended up wanting that German Shepherd. So I had at that point in my head that I was going to be a professional trainer, but I didn't know how I was going to go pursue the craft. So I got sergeant with the same attitude I was there, showing off, doing all my obedience. So I put all my knowledge that I'd gotten from Princess and put it into the Shepherd and was out doing the same thing I did with Princess. A lot of agility, people, places, things, a lot of environmental. And I didn't know what I was doing. This is just what I did to kindle the dog that I wanted, the companion dog that I wanted. But this time, I wanted the dog to bite somebody. I wanted them to protect that backyard. Nobody was going to come into my house again and do something like that to me. So this bean was in my head. I went out and got a book by William Kohler called Guard Dog Training Book. Some of you know that book already. Some of you probably read it, but it's way out of print by now. And I think I bought that book, lost one, and bought another one. And so I had two of them over the time that I had. So I've read that book several times. I live by that book. I ended up reading that book to go into and do the work that it took to train sergeant in bite work. I went all over the place. I was getting a magazine called Dog Sports Magazine. It was a rag that was very professionally based, went through Schutzen, because all this stuff was just starting to become relative in our world over here in the States. Before that, we didn't have any clue about what was going on in Europe and everything. Law enforcement didn't have a clue. Law enforcement went over to Germany and started buying all kinds of dogs and started coming over, and that was what they got. And their knowledge base was basically the baseboard of the German Schützens sport was brought over here to get them going in law enforcement. But they were learning and growing at the same time. Back then in the 70s, early 80s, everything was all kinds of different dogs. They'd go to the pound, they'd pick up this dog, a backyard dog, shepherds, dobies, rots. They all have taken their place in law enforcement at one time or another. And each breed has proven themselves to lack in certain areas, and it ended up becoming the Malinois the strongest. And now if you look at the back of the law enforcement cars, you will see 99.9% of the dogs are Malinois or they're Dutchies. Very small percentage of Dutchies. The Dutchies are becoming more relative all the time, but that's another breed that's a little step up from what most handlers can handle, because they have a tendency to have a little bit more stout to them, and they'll come up the leash, and if you don't treat them right, they don't take kindly to somebody that's unfair. And if they think that you're being unfair with the corrections and that sort of thing, they've got enough stout to come back on you. So do a lot of the Malinois, the KNP feline, it depends on the bloodlines, will do the same thing, but more so the Dutchies. That's why you see a lot fewer of them than you do the Malinois. Alright, so back to Sargent. So I was studying that book, did all my reading, went out and got my dog training equipment through the mail, got it sent to me, my sleeves, all the stuff, and I followed that book verbatim because I didn't have any other thing to influence me, right? And I taught my friends how to decoy. One of the first things we do, and I still use this to this day, is to set a trigger. What that means is that I will teach the dog to go from a zero, neutral state, to one of showing aggression and a bark on command and showing aggression with a key word, that quick. And I still do that to this day, because I'm a firm believer that a protection dog, more than anything else, is a deterrent factor. His presence, what he looks like, and how you deploy the dog in the sense of protecting your home and family, because that's what I deal with, civilian, I'm not law enforcement, is the critical aspect of things. I'm trying to educate my customer in regards to that and make sure we bring up deterrent factor to a degree that that dog fulfills the purpose and doesn't have to bite anybody. That's the key, because I don't want my dog to have to bite anybody. The liability is too high. But I do want my dog to do everything else and to be ready to have to defend home and family if he has to. And my goal is to build that product to a point where I know that he'll take a man and take him down if it comes to that. So we'll go back into those issues a little later, but back to the Sargent. So I went, shopped everywhere, took my $500, found a dog. It was in Cambria, a small little town. Some lady had a German Shepherd and a litter of puppies. I went up to go check him out. And the father, the male of the stud, ended up almost biting me when I was there. I scared the shit out of him. I ended up picking my puppy, ended up with a dog that I named Sargent. Took him home. And that was my first learning process of learning to rear a puppy. Feed him, cook an egg, give him a little more higher protein, a little bit of cottage cheese to the food, 3 times a day, watching the stool, all the things that came with my first experience of rearing a puppy and putting what I thought was the right way of doing things. And I made a lot of mistakes, but at the same time I did a lot of quality things. That dog worked like a top. Very well trained, a lot like Princess, and I turned him into my companion dog. And then I started doing the protection and taught him to go off on a dime, to do the bite work, and he turned out to be a pretty damn good dog. I ended up taking him with me with my first real job, living in the back of a kennel. I had him at 16 years of age. I went out and I knew I wanted to train dogs at this point. That's all I cared about. So I was putting myself in that direction. And I found a training firm in my small town that was one of the only ones in that county at the time. It was called Canine Behavior Center. They did a lot of behavior problems, a lot of behavior. But at the same time, they did a little protection. They'd run some fences, they'd do a little bite work. It wasn't anything real extensive like we've turned into today, but they did do a little bit of it. I ended up, the guy that owned the training firm had been a canine handler in the military. So he taught me all kinds of things, but one of the things he had that he put together was a lecture format, and it was verbatim. I was told by him as I started to get to know him, and sold myself using Sergeant as my demo dog, went out and showed off to them, had the dog go off, and I did it all on my own. Their jaw dropped. They went, wow, you did that all on your own? Remember, I'm only a kid with no influence around us, and how did this guy learn this stuff, right? So they were pretty impressed, and that got me a job with them. I started riding around with them everywhere, and I wanted to be able to teach classes and give the classes that they gave, because they gave classes in each park, in each town. Monday night they'd be here, Tuesday night they'd be there, Wednesday night they'd be in Morro Bay, Paso Robles, wherever they would set up their classes within each in middle of town park, right? So then he gave me a little cassette tape. That was back in the day of cassette tapes. Remember those? Gave me this cassette tape, and he goes, Mark, I need you to go home. This is the first lesson. Learn it verbatim. You have to say it and be able to repeat it back to me verbatim. All right? So I went home and I started studying that lecture. And then he started taking me out as he was working dogs, the privates that he was working. And he would take the dog and he would go work him, and he'd start teaching me how to handle the leash and how to do all the things I needed to in a professional format, which is what I teach to this day. A lot of motor movements, exactly where your hand should be on the leash, slide down, switch hands, place. I remember these things like they were yesterday. So I went through that whole thing, and then I started giving the first lesson. And I took the second lesson home and studied it and learned how to do it. So by the time I got done, it was an eight-week course. Heel, sit, down, stay, come, and a finish. Whoop, that's only 6 weeks. Well, you had your first day that you had to break the customer in. There wasn't really a lecture format on that, though we did, go through a whole thing telling them what equipment they needed, what they needed to have. You need a 6-foot leash, you need a choke chain, teaching them how to put the choke chain on, all the little things that started their whole 8-week course. And then the next week was the first heel, right, and left coming. Heel, right, and left automatic sit was the first lesson. So start and stop, automatic sit, start and stop. So then I took the second lesson home, then the third, then the fourth. Pretty soon I was giving all the lessons. And then we did a lot of, like I said, behavioral problems, things like that we did. Excuse me, I'm at Tractor Supply with a couple dogs, trying to get out of here early, 9 o'clock, so I can get some dogs worked. So then we went through that, and I worked for them for a couple years. I knew I wanted to do bite work. That's all I cared about, was doing bite work at this point, because I was reading Dog Sports Magazine. That was the spark that really flew my boat, right? And I would read articles from David Reavers. He was writing articles for Dog Sports Magazine. I remember getting so excited because I would see things that he was doing, and he'd write an article about something, and I'd be going, I'm doing that. And I was doing it kind of ahead, just out of instincts, right? Or Armin Winkler. Armin Winkler used to write for Dog Sports Magazine. I used to read his. His were always really scientific, heady type of articles. I remember he had a whole series that he was doing for them as well. So all these people that I knew and knew of over the years. So that was my start. And then I ended up working for them for a couple years, and straight out of high school, within the first week of graduation. I graduated out of high school. Within that next couple of weeks, I was on a bus with no dog. I left Sergeant back at the house, and then went from there to Oakland, California, and I did my first stint living in the back of the kennel. Eat, breathe, and sleep dogs, kennel maintenance, and learn to train dogs in a commercial format, in a structured format from a company that's offering their services to the public. And I got pretty good at it. I got up to about 10 dogs a month that I could handle in different phases of training. Obedience, protection, problem solving, we did all that in there too. One of the owners of the company, in fact he's still around, ProTrain, it was the name of the company, was out of the Seeing Eye Dogs, San Rafael Seeing Eye Dogs. So his emphasis was a lot of environmental, and I learned a lot from him as far as how they did things and how they got their dogs to be able to go on the buses into the restaurants and all that, because right at that time, late 70s or so, I think, is when San Rafael was established. And they ended up having to get through it because before then you couldn't have your dogs in restaurants. You couldn't have them on the buses. They were the ones that broke that glass ceiling and got that to all start. San Rafael Seeing Eye Dogs, one of the best seeing eye dog schools in the world to this day. Though there are other organizations now with seeing eye dogs, San Rafael is where it started all of it. And they also started a breeding program, and they proved how viable quality breeding program is into producing a certain type of a dog. They have dogs that are bred for specifically to be seeing eye dogs, and their results went way up higher because of their ability to do that, and they proved that. So, all right, so that's about it. That's how I kind of got started, how Sargent got started, what I did with him, and I had him at Pro Train. I had a friend bring him in a few weeks, about a month, and he came with me, and I went and I had a mentor. I'll end the story with this. My mentor was by the name of OJ, small little African-American dude. Keep in mind that I was born in a town that didn't have very many black people. I think I had maybe 2 or 3 of them in my life growing up. It's all white. Back then we didn't have African-Americans. They were in the city, you know. They weren't in the country as much. So that being the case, it was culture shock to get on the bus and to get off the bus at San Pablo Avenue. I think the kennel was on the same thing, Greyhound bus station, being scared diddly squatless because it was a culture shock for a little white boy to be going into the city and being in an environment like that in the neighborhood where it was all African Americans. That was pretty ballsy of me to do something like that. And I was scared, don't get me wrong. That's why every time I went out of that kennel, Sergeant came with me and went on a downstay outside the liquor store, outside the store when I went to go shopping. And I didn't have transpo. I took a bus there and I had no transpo, and I lived in that neighborhood. You know, that was where I lived. I didn't go much of anywhere at the time. So that's how I got started in the profession. A lot more stories to tell, and we'll go through how I met Cesar Milan, the dog whisperer, and we'll kind of keep along this series that we got going. And it's just one route and one way, but there's a lot of the reason that I am who I am when people get around me and they sense and they experience my expertise in regards to what I feel about the industry, because I'm very indoctrinated in the industry, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along. So, all right, Mark Ferrasci, Protect Dog Training, signing off. Have a good day, guys.